Just generally, many bond issuers are not guarantors themselves, especially for revenue bonds, but instead just pass-through entities. So for example, Brown University can borrow, and they can borrow using a state agency revenue bonds, where there's no general obligation, full faith, credit, tax, and power of the state is not in play, but instead just general revenues or monies available to the borrower. So it may be that EBT is not really a guarantor here. To get back to the question about should default be a choice here, and if so, how would one go about it? You've identified, I've been in the bond market a long time. I originally, my name is Cusack of Gary Sasse, resident of Rhode Island, and originally I was a municipal finance investment banker in a very large firm in New York City, and later I was a portfolio manager at a municipal bond fund. I'm also a portfolio manager, and I also sat on the boards of issuers. For example, we did $800 million here in Rhode Island of tobacco securitizations, and I did both those transactions as a member of that board. Another pass-through agency, by the way. In any case, I think it's very important. I've been a bond investor, I've been a portfolio manager, I've been a public official, and even an assistant mayor in this problem. So I've been on different sides of these kinds of transactions. And to me, a moral obligation means something. But I think in light of our circumstances in Rhode Island, that and given the key role of the General Assembly in deciding whether or not to appropriate, which is what's required under the bond documents, that they all those representatives represent people, and there ought to be a dialogue about this, particularly given the choice involved with respect to this $100 billion. Should it go to pay these bonds, or should it go somewhere else? And that's a big question. By the way, the concept of bond insurance hasn't been brought up today, and so there's not going to be probably negotiation with bondholders if bondholders are insured. Those bonds are insured, so there's an insurer, and that's the entity that you would be dealing with in any kind of negotiation. But with respect to this idea of getting the information, what would be the consequences of a default for the state of Rhode Island? You need to know the geo credit. In the Spokane, Washington case, there was a downgrade of that city. By the way, those bonds were not insured. Those are moral obligation bonds that defaulted. And and not that insurance is the key difference, but there was a downgrade. Municipal bond insurance and all bond insurance, the rating agencies, have gone through a tremendous transformation in the last, since 2008, similar to what they went through in the 70s with Whoops, which is the largest municipal bankruptcy in history. And so they're now trying to show how tough they are. So they're not going to want to say, okay, this is easy. There'll be no impact. But you can ask the question. These are surprisingly negotiable, ratings are. As you found out last week with Morgan Stanley. Anyway, there's a lot of talk and reports about negotiation. You can have that dialogue. What are you trying to find out? Trying to find out if the rating agencies, how they would react to the state of Rhode Island's general obligation credit to a default of these moral obligation bonds. So how do you answer that? You've got to ask the question. There may be a reluctance on the part of elected officials or appointed officials in the state to ask that question to avoid the appearance of telegraphing the intent. Understandable. There could be a good government entity. There could be Rikers. There could be another one who could ask those same questions and find out. They wouldn't be negotiating, but they would be gathering some facts. And they could have volunteers who are experts at this. They exist here in Rhode Island who could help them. There are people who are bond counsel in Rhode Island. There are participants in the market. There are mutual fund managers. There are people who have some experience. So they could ask those questions and you could find out. I think, though, that this dialogue is very important because of the choices involved in this $100 billion. I mean, we're in dire circumstances in Rhode Island, as we all know, and people at that table know better than most.
Excellent suggestion. Very. Thank you. You want to volunteer?
Yeah. Just one response to that, I think that was very insightful. with regard to the rating, I would avoid overestimating how important the rating is for the state as an issuer. I think a rating is really important if there's some water district nobody's heard of and the investors aren't directly familiar with it. But when you're the state, both you have, to a greater extent, investors making their own credit decisions about the credit quality because it's a large enough entity. And so you see, California has gotten downgraded, often well below Illinois, but still continues to borrow more cheaply than Illinois because the investors make their own judgment. The other matter is that, to a significant extent, the municipal bond market is captive. In order to gain, when municipal bonds are issued tax-free, in order to get the advantage of not paying state income tax, you have to reside in the same state as where the bond was issued. So Rhode Island is basically selling municipal bonds to Rhode Island residents, and if they decide they don't like Rhode Island credit, they have to take a big tax hit if they then want to go buy bonds issued by some other state. Now, maybe they can buy bonds issued by cities and towns, but it seems unlikely that they'll conclude that the state's more likely to default than cities and towns within the state. So I think the state has, while it's important to engage with the rating agencies and figure out how the rating agencies will react, there's also an ability to take with a little bit of a grain of salt what the rating agencies say. The real question you have to answer is how the bond markets themselves are going to react to a change.
And you mentioned that Rhode Island borrows more cheaply than other states similarly rated. And that's true not because there's so many wealthy people here relatively upstanding indebtedness. It's not why. It's the reason because it's scarce. And most bonds are held by municipal bond funds, publicly traded, open-end bond mutual funds, and probably have an insurance company. But they need diversification of portfolios. So when they see a Rhode Island issue come up, they tend to want it because of the scarcity. So that's why trade is rich.